obviously, global pandemic, mobile outcomes. So that's where Chase will take you through some of the findings of GlobalWebIndex, along with wealth gaps, advertising, and online representation of various consumer groups. A quick generational recap relevant to what Chase is talking about, and actually linking to the next section, which is how we move into 2021, and a summary of key insights at the end of the deck. I'll hand you over to Chase.
Thanks very much. So just quick background about GWY. We are a market research company that provides consumer insight into leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. We're home to the world's largest ongoing study into the digital consumer. We have the largest panel of consumers globally at 22 million people across 46 markets. Our research is representative of around 2 billion internet users aged 16 to 64. And this is all made available through an intuitive subscription-based platforms for teams to dive in and cross-analyze their own audiences. So with that out of the way, I want to take you today through some important consumer behavior changes that we've seen in the past year or so. When I was planning this presentation, I had a pretty big challenge. How do you distill the impact of COVID-19 on consumers in such a short space of time? Highly diverse between regions, making it even more difficult to sum up the outbreak. So what I want to do today is narrow down on a consumer segment, which has not only experienced some of the greatest degrees of behavior change in 2020, but is also set to become the most prominent consumer group in the next decade. I'm talking, of course, about older age groups. And when was the last time you saw a presentation about Generation X or baby boomers? But now think how many presentations you've seen about Generation Z and millennials. Well, there's people again in Europe and North America. Marketers are obsessed with generations, but often really only with the new shiny generations. Generation Z have taken a pedestal out from under millennials as the newest enigma for the modern marketer. But Generation X and baby boomers have mainly been left at the margin. Now, there's no doubting the importance of the younger generations in the consumer landscape. Just look at Airbnb. Its market cap doubled on its IPO because people see Airbnb as the future of travel. What they mean by that is they see that Airbnb taps directly into the preferences of Gen Z and millennials like no other travel company. But marketers do need to pay more attention to older groups too. And they've just been confronted with more reason than ever to do this, because in terms of digital behavior, the so-called generation-defining year of 2020 has been much more impactful for Generation X and boomers compared to their younger counterparts. Barely any part Now, the digital knowledge gap is wider among older consumers, but most tech these days is so intuitive that the major hurdle really is just in exposing people of doing new things in new ways. And lockdown did exactly that. Lockdown has closed this gap fairly rapidly as reliance strengthens on the internet. Now, of course, to find one of the most obvious indicators of increased internet reliance, we just need to look at how long people are spending on the gateway to the internet that they keep in their pockets, their smartphones. So the chart you're seeing in front of you now shows growth in time spent online on mobiles per day among Generation X and boomers, comparing before and after the pandemic hit. What's interesting about this is that while reach of smartphones among older groups has increased too, the real change has come from people deepening their engagement. We often find that where mobile engagement grows, broader digital engagement follows. We did frequent research over the course of Q2 and early Q3. And as lockdowns restrictions came into effect, spikes in digital activity followed. For younger groups, it didn't take long for these spikes to settle down. For older groups, their engagement continued to flourish. Now, you'll notice in this chart that some of the strongest growth in time spent on mobiles among older groups comes from mature markets, particularly in North America and Europe. Now, these are regions with older skews in their own online populations. And that means that the changes we're seeing right now among older groups will have potentially profound impacts on the digital trends in those countries and therefore where companies should be putting their resources and their attention. When we think of change, we typically think of younger people, right? If we trace back the typical path of tech adoption, we'll usually find that the younger groups are at the start of that journey. They're considered the vanguards of change, the early adopters, and the pioneering new ways of doing things, the customer base really easiest to capture in many ways. And thanks to the pandemic, older groups have now gone a long way in catching up with these younger adults across many digital behaviors. Now, if these countries have older skews in their online populations, that means that behavior shifts we're witnessing right now among older groups will be the real drivers of change, because they'll have a bigger impact on the broader consumer landscape compared to their younger counterparts. I'm not saying that younger groups are not now relevant, far from it, that's not the case. What I'm saying is that they've really just taken a big step, the distinctions between young and old, when from a digital standpoint, have just taken a big step towards becoming less relevant. And that these older groups are likely to be the ones that really move the needle in terms of investment in non-traditional digital channels. From a practical perspective, it means that some companies might now find that it's easier to target older consumers where their ability to create and capture value might be at its highest. And I think online grocery provides us with a really interesting discussion point here. Next slide, please. A lot of ink has been spilled on the topic of e-commerce during the pandemic. I should be clear about something about e-commerce. While new uptake of e-commerce is definitely newsworthy and there's been a lot of increase in penetration, our data shows that one of the biggest drivers of change in e-commerce, much like with mobile, hasn't so much been in new people shopping online or an increase in reach, but more from existing shoppers buying more products online that they typically bought in store. So their engagement with e-commerce was deepening. That's what really was the transformation effect. Now, online grocery is probably the most prominent example of this, but other categories like household goods, electronics, personal care, even luxury items in the US, these have all seen increased spend online. And this migration online has caused more people to research these kinds of items online before buying as well. And notice how big the growth in online grocery shopping is in Europe, and particularly in North America, regions where growth before the pandemic was hard won, especially among older consumers. In these Western regions, Gen X and Boomers typically comprise the vast majority of household food shoppers. And although many older millennials are now firmly in the stages of their lives where they're looking after families and handling household shopping for more people than just themselves, it still remains that older groups are often where the most value can be created and reaching consequences. Let's not forget that online grocery is a high frequency category. A pair of shoes or electronics online, it's habit forming, it increases people's familiarity, confidence with online, helps to keep online options front of mind moving forwards. Let's broaden our focus a bit here. We're talking about reliance on the internet, and reliance would insinuate that these older groups are using the internet to fulfill more of their basic needs. Someone once told me that a trend isn't a change in what people need, it's a change in how people expect to fulfill those needs. And that's what we're getting at here. The pandemic has driven older consumers to shift their with online grocery. Digital transformation in financial services has been hampered by older consumers sticking to managing their finances offline, especially in those Western countries we've talked about. So this chart shows usage of finance apps and internet banking services among Gen X. In the course of 2020, adoption of these tools accelerated among older groups in North America and Europe. And this is another really great example about how behavior shifts among older groups could really have powerful material results on entire industries. So obviously there's a lot of moving parts here. FinTech ecosystems are much more developed than they were a few years ago, but it still remains the case that traditional banks are still the main interface between consumers and their money. For banks look extent of bankruptcies and loan defaults postponed by government rescue packages. Bank branches were costly before the pandemic and they're still costly now, and there were closures before the pandemic, and this is probably going to be accelerated. Given that the majority of bank account holders in Western countries are aged in their 40s and older, the future banking landscape is probably going to be more determined by the current choices of older consumers than you might expect. And actually, finance gives us another example of older groups moving something online, which at one point was the most physical and frequent thing they did every day without thinking. Next slide, please. That's paying for goods and services. In every region, usage of mobile payment services increased fairly dramatically among these older groups. And we know why this is happening. It's a matter of safety. Now, the basic, for many, that might automatically conjure up images of young people, especially in Asian countries where super apps are popular, like China or South Korea. But we need to rethink this and become a tool accessible for anyone, even older groups. 15% of older groups used them each month in Q3 of 2019. Fast forward to less than a year later, and that's grown to 22%. In fact, people over 50 were PayPal's fastest growing segment from March to April. And it's really interesting to see the impact of this on the broader payments landscape in these countries. For a while, we've been wondering whether the contactless trend or when the contactless trend would really take off in earnest in these Western countries, but it's often hit a ceiling due to the prevailing habits of older consumers still relying on cash or plastic. So we've covered sustenance, security, and safety, but what about social fulfillment? Next slide, please. Have older groups also been looking into online channels to gain a sense of belonging among this craziness? Well, it turns out they have. And you guessed it, it's the regions with the older population skews, Europe and North America, where we witness the biggest shifts. What happens when you forcibly separate people at a time when technology lets us see and hear each other? We look online, don't we? And more specifically to social media. You often hear the younger generations are ditching Facebook because their parents are signing up and cramping their style. But again, that's one of those generalizations which is riddled with holes. They're not ditching Facebook, but until March, Facebook usage and social media usage were largely one and the same for Gen X and especially boomers. There are many ways to measure social media usage beyond the monthly user counts you see in earnings calls and news reports. Our monthly visitation data shows that older groups outside of China have embraced new platforms like TikTok and messaging apps during Q2, especially parents with young children in the West as well. The most striking results come from frequent usage in a day. Messaging apps in particular have found ways to embed themselves in older groups' day-to-days, coinciding with increased daily time spent on mobiles. The killer app, quite literally, or quite predictably, sorry, has been voice and video calling, which older groups have adopted in swathes. Rather than just scrolling through updates, social media has proved itself as a viable source of belonging and social connection for older groups. They're now relying on seeing and hearing their friends and family on their smartphones. So this has consequences on the makeup of marketing mixes. In those Western countries with those older, faster aging populations, younger social media engagement hasn't always persuaded marketers to move the needle towards digital over traditional channels. This could prove decisive in changing that. Next slide, please. So I think we need to cover why this group matters. They matter because of their demographic significance and their purchasing power, especially as the world gets older. We shouldn't just be paying more attention to them because there's going to be more of them than younger groups in many countries. We should be paying attention to them because there is a significant wealth gap. Next slide, please. There's a reason why millennials are referred to as Generation Rent. Many have been priced out of the property ladder after the 2008 recession. Depending on where you're standing, their parents' generations were either lucky or savvy enough to cash in on lower tertiary education costs, more affordable property deposits before massive price booms, and generous pension schemes by today's standards thought to be unsustainable for younger workers. Now in this chart, you can see that in every region, older groups hold significantly more wealth than their younger groups, whether that's in the value of their savings or their income or in their ownership of property without a mortgage. And this is not to take sides on that perennial generation debate about who got luckiest. Younger generations benefit from opportunities and freedoms their parents could only dream of. It's to show that older groups already have the most market power, and this will only increase as populations age. Thanks to technology, people are living longer, healthier lives, and they'll be able to enjoy their superior purchasing power in retirement more than any generation before them. Earlier on, I mentioned the fact that people over 50 were PayPal's fastest growing segment from March to April. Well, in that time, PayPal's total payment volume recovered to pre-COVID levels. And the reason why really goes to show why this group is so important. Payment volume recovered because of the larger purchase sizes made by older age groups. And again, it comes down to where the most value can be created and captured for technology platforms in Western markets. And many tech platforms will find that it's among older groups. Expanding user growth and engagement has mainly come from younger groups up until the pandemic. With the influx of older groups, this should be very good news for their ability to monetize on these platforms. Next slide, please. Now, before I cap off, I feel like the next two slides can help put what I've talked about so far into perspective. So here you're looking at the percent of each generational group who say that they feel represented in advertising. Just look at Europe. Only 5% of Gen X and boomers feel represented. Boomers least so. Just 3% in Europe feel represented, dropping to as low as 2% in places like Germany. Let's think about this in the context of marketing mixes. So research is finding in Western countries that marketing spend does not always reflect consumer behavior. We recently partnered up with Facebook to look at Germany, and we found this was the case. Mobile was very underinvested. So channels like mobile and social media are often underinvested in the context of where consumers are actually spending their time. But traditional channels are often overinvested. So while marketing mixes are still largely the product of where older consumers are spending their time, even if this is actually outdated after the pandemic, the marketing itself is clearly not representing older consumers. So I think there's a big contradiction here. Now keep these figures in mind when you look at the next slide, which is the share of Gen X and boomers in regional online populations aged 16 to 64. Next slide, please. So in Europe and North America, these older groups represent over half of internet users aged 16 to 64. If we were to look at total population, we know that number would probably get much higher based on demographic census data. So let's look at Europe. 52% of internet users aged 16 to 64 fall within the Gen X and boomer generations, yet just 5% of them feel represented in advertising. There's no denying the importance of younger age groups to the modern marketer, but I do think the pandemic has shown strong contradictions between demographic makeup of the global consumer base and where marketing spend is going. This is really put into question given the technology trends we're seeing among older age groups. I think that's me.
Thank you, Jace. That was really good, very insightful. So the next section is really just to give you a very, very quick, brief view of what these generations, who these generations are, and basically what their media consumption habits currently tend to be. The recap is basically baby boomers and Gen X, so the older of the two gens that are currently relevant. You know, the 2021 age being anywhere between 57 and 75, the baby boomers, and then Gen X anywhere between 41 and 56. I think one of the interesting things, obviously, is with COVID, and is actually this idea of that, you know, obviously baby boomers are the most affected by COVID, but actually Gen X, you know, are generally will for the foreseeable future actually carry the significant additional tax load post COVID, and actually be hardest hit with regards to the debt load, and actually the responsibility of actually bringing up the next generation. I think with regards to media consumption, it's obviously it's really interesting, because as you'll see later in the presentation, but for the moment is this idea of this at home piece actually governing people's choices and decisions with regards to their purchasing power. Media consumption tends to, in these older demographics, tend to focus mostly on actually still traditional media, TV as an overall halo effect across the board, but actually to an extent traditional media as well. Things like newspapers and magazines and radio have become are very prominent. The other key thing actually with baby boomers is actually the fact that so many have Facebook accounts, but predominantly to stay in touch with their friends and family as their prime need for that. The younger sets on generations, actually Gen Y and Gen Z. I think Gen Y is a really interesting piece because they're really stuck in between of actually just finishing their education and actually then moving into wanting to move into the workforce, but obviously saddled with massive student debt. And pre-COVID, but actually very much moving into next year is the idea of the need to delay major life purchases and decisions. Gen Z, I think, probably from a shaping event, I think COVID will have absolutely shaped the decisions. They're really in that space of at university making decisions in terms of what they might study or how they might move into a career. And obviously COVID is affecting their education and massively affecting their potential their career choices. But in terms of their finances, very interestingly, they are similar to their parents in their attitudes, and wanting to avoid debt after seeing millennials struggle at large. The next section really talks about moving into 2021, and just top 10 trends really of what we're seeing overall. I think it's the seismic events of this year will echo long into next year and the year and beyond. As a shift towards investment performance marketing has really accelerated the trend towards digital channels. I think it's really key to understand that obviously brands must find new creative solutions to achieve distinctiveness and stand out in during the pandemic and post. I think whether we can actually begin talking about post-pandemic next year, the jury's still out on that position, but we can at least start seeing light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully, I think the key thing about that marketers should be thinking about actually into next year is the important role they play in the position to actually become that central communication between understanding what consumers' needs and wants and their positioning of what their brand and what their offering is. I think brands are flexing. We've seen a lot of brands actually flexing towards meeting consumer demand via D2C and so on. But then obviously the need to build out their infrastructure within that space. Where others, marketers are brands in good positions where they're able to double down on brand building and that's really come to the fore massively, particularly with brands that have benefited from the current status quo. The truth though is that being able to bank on historical data and historical performance as a lead into what might happen moving forward, those days are gone, and they won't be around for a while, I think. So it's this idea of being able to how do we manage our planning and our strategy where everything's in flux all the time. And it's really the way we see it. It's really held in. I think it's very important to understand that the current playing field, the current ecosystem, and therefore how to then think about strategy and planning moving forward. These four main pillars really, which is obviously volatility, market volatility, economic volatility, workforce volatility, but then obviously the uncertainty that brings, and the sheer complexity and ambiguity that brings, I think is really a challenge. I think businesses will continue to feel this disruption and ongoing upheaval as severe economic recession looms. I think the thing we can control is how we react, and obviously this idea of the need to revisit strategy and purpose from the ground up, and refocus and relook at that at regular intervals, looking for signs of change. Really beginning to understand the data, making sure that data is clean data, to then make insightful decisions from, and then activate moving forward. I think, as in the previous slide, marketing can grow its influence by being the link to the market, and I think these pieces are really key. Thinking about diversity, thinking about inclusion, ensuring that your position is all encompassing is super key. As mentioned earlier, this idea of the at-home lifestyle, at the moment, as it was, this really started in March when lockdown 1.0 actually began, but is still very much a big part of the play. And I think it will remain a driver of change, and it's partly driven the expansion of the online consumer profile. I think for brands, this means discovering where and how to become a welcome part of our at-home lives. We've seen certainly with a lot of our clients, particularly in the beauty space, where they've seen exponential growth beyond their targets, on the basis of this trend actually driving that growth. Consumers are looking to enhance their home lifestyle, and that's become the priority. Local is a key consideration. And I think brands do have the opportunity to make COVID socializing a better experience. It's one of those elements that if your brand allows for that extension, then be that, fill that gap, as a way of accentuating the consumer's lifestyle at that moment, and certainly into next year. And off that point, I think this idea of health and wellness, I think there's an article recently that I read that talks about every business, every brand is in the health business. Health and wellness will remain center stage as the rebuild begins. Consumers expect that from brands. They expect them to keep their consumers safe, expect them to show empathy with regards to what people are going through. It's not purely driven by money and ROI, but also the extension of the brand. What does this brand actually stand for in this new space? We've seen a lot of other brands, things like the growing range of brands moving into the space, adapting to cater to these emerging consumer priorities around physical and mental well-being. One of our clients, Aromatherapy Associates, the brand we work with has focused on what they call the consumer's core state. And then they've seen incredible growth this year. It's really being able to align the brand with where a lot of their consumers are, and then matching that need, like for like. CRM and first party data. I think the reason I've put this in here is really to just to say that actually this will never stop being important, and actually more important now than ever. I think to want to chase this earlier points with regards to catering to older audiences, understanding the importance of these older audiences, is actually the need to personalize for these older audiences and the like, understanding their life cycle, understanding how to then segment their behavior to the point where it's actually useful, and being able to actually address those needs and the data points. The chart in front of you just basically gives a very top line show of how to do this with something like email, where you've got these 4 main points of obviously reach, acting, conversion, and engagement. But actually, that this consumer journey is not linear, but actually cyclical. And that users go through multiple periods of awareness, engagement, multiple levels, and then actually moving towards conversion. But actually beyond conversion, actually then moving into the second cycle of effectively following McKinsey's loyalty loop, which is effectively advocacy and repeat purchase, and how that whole journey is actually managed by the brand, and more importantly, maintaining contextual relevance in their message, to see more of that journey, and to keep the story flowing in a way that makes sense to the consumer. I think the other point that I wanted to bring up was actually just this idea of, marketer's role is not easy, and it's just getting harder. I think the third party cookies are on the verge of obsolescence with regards to GDPR and unilateral actions of companies across the board, the Apple and Google of this world. I mean, Amazon doesn't talk to Google, Google doesn't talk to Facebook, Facebook doesn't talk to Apple, and Apple doesn't talk to Google. So in this idea of being able to follow the user end to end across multiple platforms is basically a thing of the past. So what are we left with? Effectively, the idea of, off the back of the last slide and actually talking about this one is actually context becomes key as we lose access to this audience information. I think this idea of audience interest and attention grows as marketers are looking for new metrics. But what are these new metrics? What are the new KPIs? How do we define the graying lines between awareness and consideration, and then consideration actually to a closer point of purchase? I think brands are exploring new strategies for personalization, and I think a big way of actually addressing this is through creative, and trying to make sure that messaging is relevant as possible. I think the being able to automate as much of this process as possible is really a key thing. I think marketing automation and machine learning. I think a lot of brands, what we've seen a lot this year is actually a lot of brands aren't as set up as they could be. I think things like DCO, dynamic creative optimization, has been around for a while now, but we're still seeing a very static way of dealing with creative, a very static way of dealing with data, and I think you lose what happens is effectively you lose that personalization on the endpoint. When I first started out in digital, I remember a conversation with my head of digital at the time saying, you can have the best algorithms and the best setup in the background. The user only sees the ad, and so work backwards from that. And I think that's really, really key to think about, to start thinking about things this way, particularly where the data and the back-end segmentation has changed. That landscape of walled gardens is very much there. So think about the ad, work back from the ad in terms of, and let the technology and the data guide us in terms of what that ad needs to be relative to the audience we're trying to talk to. And really the second last point, which is this, the rise of direct to consumer. I think one of our clients, Halo Sleep, has really understands the space very, very well. And it's not necessarily the solution for all brands, but it's certainly we have seen a shift in distribution and how brands are wanting to own the relationship with the end audience themselves. And ultimately, this will obviously have an effect on brand strategy and obviously media investment. And I think that it's a key point, and I think something that we'll certainly see moving into 2021. I think a lot of brands will adapt and make a go of D2C alongside their existing strategy. We'll begin to see these hybrids, I think, between that. Chase, did you want to talk about live streaming? Because I think there's one point that we discussed earlier.
Sorry, just unmute myself. Yeah, we did a bit of research into live streaming. I didn't manage to get too much of dig into the data too much over the last week, but we've definitely found that there's an appetite for live streaming to move from China into the West. It's in one of our latest reports, and I'm happy to distribute that report afterwards.
Cool. So the last point of this section is talking about influencers. I think for a lot of brands, what we're seeing is a lot of brands are still underutilizing the power of influencers, and I think a lot of it is due to the fact that they haven't really understood it, or they've had a bad experience in terms of being able to identify the right influencer to actually drive audience engagement, or being able to ratify in terms of understanding what is the end effect of working with an influencer. I think there's multiple points here which I wanted to bring up, and I won't go through all of them, but just some of the key ones, which is this idea of the rise of the micro influencer. I mean, they may not have the massive follower counts of the big players in the space, but they can be powerful. Not only are they much more cost effective, but you can find influencers who have niche audiences that are aligned with your target consumer. In many cases, their engagement levels can be very high. A lot of them create their own content, and you'll be able to get more frequent posts. The relationships can obviously also then be very, very close with them, and they effectively become an extension of your brand, which is the point. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was actually this idea of focus on performance marketing. As the influencer space grows crowded, clients seeking growth from their campaigns will shy away from paying for brand awareness claims that don't always translate into profit. Also, the main challenge for creators in 2021 will be to monetize their accounts. We will see more performance-based deals between brands and influencers. This idea of pay-per-view, pay-per-click, pay-per-sale, etc. This will become more of a reality certainly next year. The other piece that I wanted to bring up was actually talking about this influencers as an always-on strategy. Influencers who are contracted on an ongoing basis increase brand loyalty and attention. Fact. The days of influencer marketing as a one-off strategy are over. In fact, I think a recent research study recommended that marketers spend something like 25% of their digital budget on influencer marketing because it is more authentic and delivers better results. They become amplifiers, not just communicators. Creators are the storytellers, and the clients are putting them at the core of their content strategy. This is the way to make influencer marketing more authentic and effective. I think clients are thinking of influencer marketing in a much more strategic way, like a communication campaign, integrated into their marketing strategy, rather than a channel to boost messages like paid, organic, and PR. So our key insights, I'll hand you over back to Chase.
Cool, thanks very much, Marco. So the key insights for my presentation, I guess, would say, trends haven't been universal. It's a global pandemic, but the outcomes have been highly diverse. I think for us, because we run a harmonized data set, which means that we ask almost the same survey in all of the 46 countries we track. And that means you can compare these countries in a like-for-like manner. I think that COVID-19 has shown us that there's never been a stronger case for harmonized research. The virus spread at different rates for different reasons around the world, and being able to see that through the harmonized research was really, really valuable. So the pandemic is really global in reach, but its outcomes have been highly diverse, depending on the countless factors, including geography, culture, and containment as well. And the magnitude of the global event is obvious, and it's going to leave a lasting impression on consumer attitudes and behaviors in each country. I think also it's about knowing who moves the needle as well. There's a reason why people are often saying that COVID is more of an accelerator of trends than an instigator. Many key trends which existed before the pandemic were often coming up against friction from older consumers, especially in older countries, attached to old habits. Those countries with older skewing populations are the one I'm talking about here. But that's about to change, because the pandemic has really been quite a defining event in the digital behaviors of older age groups. And the trends which have been accelerated by the pandemic, particularly in advanced economies, are trends that have hit a bit of a ceiling in many ways because of the dominance of older consumers' behaviors. So collectively, older consumers who have adopted many digital behaviors will have a material impact on the broader landscape. And this is going to be a big catalyst in propelling these trends forwards, given the market power these groups have and will have as populations continue to age over the course of this decade. Also, to think about digital positioning and targeting match the new consumer landscape. In many Western countries, we find ourselves in a bit of a peculiar position. On the one hand, marketing spend is still more reflective of the media portfolios of older groups, especially in places in Europe where mobile is underinvested and traditional channels are slightly overinvested. But the marketing itself is clearly alienating those same older age groups because it doesn't represent them. The tech adoption of older groups since the pandemic is really only exposing this contradiction even more. I think that's really my key insights.
Great. So I think my top 9 points is really that we want to leave you with is this shift to performance marketing will continue unabated moving into next year, as obviously brands seek to maximize their budget. But I think it's really important to balance that with creativity, to stand out. I think dealing with the volatility and the uncertainty and ambiguity, I think, is the need to constantly revisit your strategy from the ground up. Expect that the next 12 months will be full of volatility, as the last as the last year has too. Reliance, understanding CRM, understanding your first-party data, maximizing that segmentation, re-looking at that, getting that organized, getting that into a good place where you can actually maximize its power, as your most valuable data source. I think consumers will also, the next point being, to expect brands to take their health and well-being into account. show empathy as a point of being genuine, I think is really, really key. Dynamic creative optimization, I think that ties back to first party and that ties back to CRM, but I think it sets up well. It's extremely powerful. It has the ability to address not only the older population, but also your younger population, in terms of making sure that strategy. Targeted influencers, I've said a lot about that, so I'm not going to go too much into that at the moment. But then, but obviously, then I'd say, dealing with this space of walled gardens, and actually the fact that these walls are ever larger and ever taller. That's really, really key. Content is king. Content is, context is even more important than that. At-home lifestyle will for the foreseeable future continue to be a key driver of change, and I think some brands will win, others will lose. I think innovation is key in terms of how brands are and creativity within that, obviously. And also that D2C is converging, and I think a lot of brands are definitely beginning to move into either pure D2C or actually creating hybrids for themselves, with their positioning allowing. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you so much, Marco. I'm going to start with some questions, but please feel free to use the chat bar if you'd like us to add an additional one. We've had some questions which will questions about some specific research that we do have, things like live streaming and the rise of importance of that going to next year. I guess, I think it's interesting that there's a greater focus on this older population going to next year, and it's been a sort of uncomfortable truth that COVID is, I don't know, not been equally as big an issue for a lot of different population segments. So, the older audience, we've got stocks at an all-time high, got property prices at an all-time high. The generation X and boomers are actually in a pretty powerful position from a spending power sort of perspective. I guess one of the questions we had is does marketing have a sort of ageism issue, in the sense that people working in marketing have tended to be quite younger, and therefore the media plans kind of reflect their own sort of age and understanding of audiences? Is it because, I mean, a lot of the conferences, events, the awards in our industry are very much focused on the sort of younger audience. A lot of the product development on the social platforms, there's not more buzz around TikTok, Snapchat than there is around some of the platforms that engage more older audiences. Does the industry have an issue here, I guess, is a question, and therefore has it been underserviced historically as an audience that we should be trying to engage with?
Is that to me or is that to Marco?
Either of you.
I think it's definitely a young industry. I think in terms of, so one of the things you said was about, is there kind of a bit of a bias towards certain channels which are more used by younger people, and is investment going in the wrong way because of people's biases? Is that kind of what you were?
Yeah.
I think kind of what we found, especially, well, so to name drop a report we did recently, we did this report with Facebook, and it was basically showing our data on where people spend their time on a daily basis and how long they're spending there. And it kind of cross-referenced it with different channels and stuff. And yeah, I think one of the things we found that was that those in many of these countries, especially in places like Germany, there's a mismatch between where people are spending their time and where the money's flowing in terms of ad engagement and stuff. So I think that actually, it's a young industry, but I think there's, in many cases, the newer platforms sometimes don't get as much investment as maybe they should in some cases. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. But.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands brands follow, which as they should. Last 9 months or so shifted yet again, and it brings me back to that point of being able to, or the need to relook at your strategy from the ground up every quarter, in particular, as the biggest time stamp, but if possible even shorter than that, and to because I think things are moving faster than a lot of planners are even taking into account at the moment.
Okay, I mean, one of the graphs obviously was talking about the rise of mobile within this segment, and historically we've been pushing clients a lot to invest into mobile. And one of the points that was raised in the chat was actually the last Google algorithm seemed to sort of indicate that having a more of a desktop strategy was actually having a better outcome than actually having a mobile. How do you sort of navigate the sort of confusion of Google and how it's rewarding brands and the content they're creating versus the data that we're actually predicting and actually seeing?
I think they're both important. I think I think mobile is trumps usage, or has historically trumped usage over desktop. I think a lot of users do their shopping and do their browsing on mobile, but then particularly with longer consideration products tend to move to desktop, as they do. I think they're both important. I think Google reward is just making it extremely important, and actually they form a very, very important part of your ecosystem, and that you need to focus on both fundamentally.
Okay, question in from Mike, I think it is. Apart from which brands do you think are getting it right in creating content and performance that's really resonating with this audience?
Or me?
Well, I'll go with you, Marco, first.
Sure. I mean, I love what Halo Sleep have done. For me, it's I know that they are one of our clients, but I think that one of the key things is that they've gone the extra mile in terms of trying to feel native on the platforms that they're investing in. They in terms of this idea of standing out and knowing or understanding the need for good creative, and having their data tell them what's good and what's bad, or what's doing better, or what should be what is the tip of the sword in terms of how to scale. They've done that very well. I think the other one, Aromatherapy Associates, again, they've also done really, really well in really understanding that. I think outside of our client base, it's been good to see brands like Domino's Pizza, for example, where they've been very good at showing empathy for this at-home audience, and being very clever about the rate at which they switch their creative, and the rate at which the sheer speed of their content plan is just phenomenal. So that's one that stands out.
And this is a bit of a curveball, because I know we were discussing it yesterday, but obviously for those brands that have had a really good sort of pandemic in terms of driving their awareness through digital channels, what happens to those brands when we come out of this and we start opening up into a more normal world? How are they going to maintain that relevancy and engagement that they've built online into a new retail world, or for a lot of those brands that have actually been born in the pandemic?
I mean, Jace, do you want to have a go at this one too?
Or should we do a separate webinar about that?
Oh yeah, I think. I mean, to be honest with you, that's a massive question, and I think anyone who says I know exactly what's going to happen next is lying. I think the reality is that I think a lot of consumers that have tried a lot of the products that of brands that have done well in the pandemic, the reality is they wouldn't have tried this. A lot of those customers would not have materialized in terms of purchasing some of those products. I think the onus falls on the quality of the product, the need for the product on a regular basis, in terms of whether that person still finds value in that purchase beyond when the world goes back to normal. However long that's going to take. I think there's a blend. And I think that blend it is another webinar, because it's a very, very interesting conversation, and I think it's the need. I think you know, we talk about actually in this presentation, talking about, you know, consumers' life cycles being and journeys being cyclical. I think if we you know, if we blow that cycle up to include multiple years, you know, like this year, next year, the year after, into a massive giant life cycle with regards to beauty brands, for example, you know, then you could argue that, you know, actually the central circle of advocacy and customer retention and making sure that existing customers feel valued beyond 2020 and beyond 2021. I think that's where the goal's going to be. You know, in terms of, and again, back to data, you know, back to CRM, who are they? Well, how, if they lapse customers, how lapsed is lapsed? I think that's where the goal's going to be beyond this current period.
Just a few more questions that are coming through. So, question from Andrea: with the pandemic, many budgets have been cut and objectives seem to have shifted heavily towards conversion and not focusing on awareness and consideration. What's your view on that?
I think it's true. I think, you know, it's all very nice to read in the drum and the campaign that, you know, Procter & Gamble's doing this and that, and, you know, doubling down on brand awareness. I mean, and so many brands we know are actually just trying to survive, you know, and there's a mix, there's a blend of that. I mean, to Andrew's point, I think, you know, when thinking about that strategy, do build from the ground up, because that at the bottom of that piece, it is about survival. But I think it's also, but I think at some point there needs to be a shift from efficiency to effectiveness. You know, I think Les Binet and Peter Field's study, in terms of the long and shorts of it, have absolutely nailed that. You know, is yes, there's survival, yes, there's short-term thinking, but at some point that well dries up. You know, and your strategy has to shift towards to a more engagement-based blend and mix, and that blend and mix will be different for every brand, you know, relative to your product, relative to your budget, relative to last month's performance, and so it's a blend. I think it's built from the ground up, but at some point you have to have engagement feeding that well, you have to have awareness feeding that well, and get to full funnel as quickly as you can.
I have a question from Daniel on attribution, one of our favorite subjects. Would you default to last click or multi-touch? We've seen last click give negative impact to channels like Facebook.
Oh, honestly, I'm not necessarily the best person to answer that question. But I do think that in walled gardens, you know, I think you look at ecosystems like Amazon, and ecosystems like, you know, social media, Facebook and Instagram. The fact that they purposely don't share their data in some of the most valuable data stays on that platform. I think this idea of first class, you know, multi-touch, last click, to some extent loses its value cross-channel. But I think with regards to multi-touch attribution on any one platform, I'd say multi-touch is still about understanding points of unique influence fundamentally, and last click, we know, is not necessarily the point of unique influence or the point of influence that's going to help you scale. So it's I hope that answers your question.
Okay. I think we'll wrap up there. What we'll do, we'll get back to everybody who's asked questions. We've not had a chance to get through them. We'll do that later today. We will be making the next day or so. Thank you so much for coming along this morning. Really appreciate it. And have a lovely Christmas. And stay safe, everybody.
Thank you very much.